following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. Hello, listeners around the world on radio, streaming, and podcast services. This is It's Not Therapy. I'm Liana and I am not a therapist, but I am your source for navigating the madness of mental health using my top 10 sayings for checking in with your best self. This week, well, it was Yom Kippur this week, so I've been contemplating much reflection. Last week, I took this show off, but it was the opposite of a real week off. Didn't get much sleep. So this whole combo has been perfect for random things from the past bubbling up in my brain, resulting in me feeling anxiety. I promised myself this Yom Kippur that I'd stay off social media, and I mostly managed. I did end up reading the news, though, and yeah, that's also a recipe for anxiety these days. It isn't that no good things are happening in the world. We all know that. But unless you're wealthy, something is biting into your sanity right now, be it the cost of food, medication shortages, loneliness, cost of renting, ballooning mortgages, and then someone just says something unnecessarily mean and petty, and you just lose it on them. And then you feel bad about snapping. And then you wonder if you're overall losing it. Anxiety's great, isn't it? That was sarcastic. That's why I've got psychotherapist, social worker, and author Richard Joelson on the show later to help take us through how to take some control over our catastrophic thinking. Anxiety is something I feel the need to keep coming back to every so often because it's so easy to slip regarding good anxiety combating habits. I know I've been struggling to have hope lately because everything just feels so disappointing. And I've talked in the past on this show about, my issues with feeling disappointed. The past of not understanding disappointment. On a gut level, I'm just tired of it. It strikes me as a waste of time, arrogant even. But I know I need to feel it because it's a real emotion. I've been finding myself having to remind myself lately that it's okay to want things. But why does everything need to be so hard, right? You ever get a weird scrape on your back and you have no idea where you got it and you really can't see it, so you start thinking about all the things it could be that are really, really bad, but you don't want to go to the doctor because it's embarrassing to make a big deal out of nothing, and you'll probably get a lecture about something unrelated. But what if it is something? Anxiety! Ever had someone just fall out of contact and your mind starts racing about what you could have possibly done to offend them and you end up losing sleep over it, but you don't dare contact them because you're afraid you're going to get yelled at? Anxiety. Ever just get sick about there not being enough money, time, or energy to do anything just when you start to get ahead? Another disaster strikes and you're back to square one if you're not behind the 8 ball actively? Anxiety. Ever been anxious about being anxious? Ever been anxious about not being anxious? It's easy to what if yourself into lousy sleep, stress eating, binge drinking, and terrible decisions. And that's the weird thing about anxiety. It's a biological function that's designed to keep us alive in wilderness survival circumstances most of us don't face. In modern life, anxiety often does more harm than good. It just eats at us and we have no idea how to make it stop. While at the same time, we're trying to ignore it because we can't do anything about it. And this is a fast track to Karen behavior, screaming at the coffee barista because they used the wrong milk. Apologies to people literally named Karen. It's such a nice name. We need another term for this whole phenomenon. Do, 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 do. Anxiety is our brain telling us that something's wrong. And if we don't validate that signal, we don't end up making the important changes that will lead to us being happier. But the process of learning to listen effectively to our anxiety instead of being controlled by it is messy trial and error without some structure to help guide us. So, the first thing I want to do with that structure is I just want everybody listening right now to take a deep breath. Ready? Take a deep breath with me. Breathing actually does make us feel calmer, actively calmer. I find it works best when you hold it in a bit at the top of the breath. Try it again. Ready? Deep breaths like that when we're feeling anxious force our systems to behave more calmly. So we feel temporarily calmer. But that won't last if we don't process our thoughts and feelings instead of always trying to outrun them. And that's why I've got an expert this week to help us control what we can control. Richard B. Joelson, clinical social work psychotherapist and author of Help Me, a psychotherapist's tried and true techniques for a happier relationship with yourself and the people you love, coming up after the break. If anything on this show inspires a question, concern, comment, I love to hear from you. Liana at nottherapyshow.com, or fill out the contact form and join our mailing list at nottherapyshow.com, or head over to the wilds of social media, Not Therapy Show on X, Twitter, and Instagram. X Twitter. We'll be back after this break. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist, and it's time for the interview, my favorite part of the show, and hopefully yours. This week, we've got a doctor of social welfare. We've got Richard B. Joelson, the author of Help Me, a self-help book, and he's also a clinical social work psychotherapist. And Richard is here to talk to us about anxiety and anticipatory dread. Now, Richard, in the article you wrote for Psychology Today, you said that was a term you came up with a client. So how do you define anticipatory dread?
Well, I think it's when people imagine worst case scenarios. They fear that some horrible thing will happen, and they feel the need to prepare for it by anticipating it. People worry as a way of trying to be prepared. What I've discovered is that rarely do they get prepared as much as they just get anxious.
Right.
And they become worried people rather than prepared for worst case scenarios. That's what the what if is about. What if I fail the test? What if I have cancer? What if he says no? Mm-hmm. And they generally wind up believing the fear as though it were a fact.
Right.
And so there is little opportunity to recover from those kinds of assertions when people are so convinced that the worst thing that's going to happen will happen.
And a lot of people, I find, treat what if he says no with what if it's can't, like they're the same in their minds. They get so whipped up with the idea of rejection, or the idea that one mistake, one rejection is gonna create this chain reaction. Where does that come from? That, the technical term is catastrophizing. Why do people do that?
Well, I think there are people who, some of them have been had experience with being criticized, possibly critical parents. They've internalized that function, and now they're basically criticizing themselves. So they are very harsh and very unforgiving when they make a mistake, when they don't succeed at something, when they're not as good at something as they thought they should be, and they turn on themselves and begin to diminish their self-esteem as a result of not being able to excel or achieve or always be okay in their various endeavors.
And that is an expectations thing, isn't it? I mean, the idea that you're going to ace every test, the idea that you're going to get a job on your first interview. That's not what statistics say. And yet that is the expectation that people have going in before we even get to consequences. So when you work with people on this, how do you approach that part of the problem?
Well, I try to dispel the notion that there is such a thing as perfection.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote an article called "Good Enough, Excellent, Perfect," and what I do in that article is talk about the fact that perfect is an ideal, it's a fantasy, it's an aspiration that is unrealistic and causes all kinds of difficulties because there's basically no such thing. There's
Mm-hmm.
no there's no perfect evening. There's no perfect presentation. There's no perfect day or perfect dinner when you have guests.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent is an achievable goal, and that's what I try to encourage, to sort of modify the expectations so that it becomes achievable and people can realize success. If perfection is the goal and it's insisted upon, there's going to be terrible disappointment or worse. So, to answer your question, what I try to do is to dismantle the notion that one has to be perfect to be successful and really help people strive for excellence again, because that's achievable.
Mm-hmm.
And
On this show, I go so far as to say perfect is a lie. Stop trying to be. It is a lie,
that's
right?
right. That's
Yeah.
right. It's an illusion. It's an
Yeah.
unhappy illusion.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. And no matter how well you do, if you're aiming for perfection, it's always going to be disappointing.
That's right.
Is that because you talked about this patient in your practice and the pivot from what if to so what? And I love the wording because I caught myself saying, the week before I read it, like somebody would say, well, if I try, I might fail. Well, so what? Well, then I'll fail. Well, so what? And it's usually embarrassment. It's usually shame underneath it all. It's but the brain runs into interesting places. And so they start plugging that shame into, when we say what's the worst that could happen, it's about what realistically could happen, not, a comet striking the earth.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think when people anticipate that they need to succeed at the highest possible level, it really invites the likelihood of terrible disappointment and self-esteem consequences because they can't achieve it. Um, I introduced the notion of "so what" as a way to modify or minimize the expectation. And, at first it sounded a little unempathic or insensitive. How can you say "so what" to somebody who's suffering because they can't achieve at the highest possible level that they're trying to achieve at? But, when that gets internalized and people begin to use that in their own emotional vocabulary, it's extremely helpful because it makes these horrible possible outcomes seem much less daunting, much less severe, much less consequential, and it really helps to put things in better perspective.
Now, this is why I love talking to social workers, Richard, because it's very practical. And how do you start the building blocks of that, as you said, modifying those doom and gloom thoughts in your head? Because at first you try to reset it and it pulls you back, right? And you try to reset it, it pulls you back. And sometimes the fight can make those worst case scenarios seem more likely than they are. So how do you work with someone to actually get an effective reset that way instead of just creating a bigger monster in their head through that struggle?
Well, I try to help people appreciate the fact that a fear is not a fact.
Mm-hmm.
A feeling is not a fact. And when people have dread, when people anticipate horrible developments or outcomes, they begin to invest in it and it becomes almost foretold. It almost becomes factual to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I really try to remind them that these are ideas, beliefs, and fears, not facts. And that concept alone has been very helpful to people who begin to question their own tendency to treat fears as though they were inevitable or unavoidable when they're not. It also introduces the notion that they have some control and some influence over what's going to happen. A lot of people who come into therapy feel sort of insight rich and change poor. They understand, they may realize that they have difficulty, but they're not able to implement the tools to begin to address those kinds of things. And that's why whenever I meet somebody for the first time in a session and I listen to them, I hear myself say, you know, you sound a little bit like you're insight rich and change poor. And, you know, their face sort of opens up and they go, oh my God, that's so true. That's really me.
Mm-hmm.
I understand some of these things, but I really don't know what to do with my understanding. And I think the hallmark of any good therapy is to get people to be able to utilize their knowledge, their understanding, their insights, their new learning, so that they can really have an impact on their lives and really begin to do the work of change.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, insight rich and change poor, because a lot of people can tell you everything that's wrong with their lives, but change is scary, right? And when you've convinced yourself that the worst is inevitable, making change is really hard. Now, that's extra hard when you've got somebody with a traumatic past, and when you do the what's the worst that could happen exercise, the reality is pretty bad. You know, the bottom
Mm-hmm.
fell out, that thing they didn't think would happen did. And one thing I hear as a very common theme is abandonment, the fact that people sold them out or stabbed them in the back, or everybody stopped talking to them. And that sounds, you know, it's not violent, it's not life-threatening, but it can be catastrophic for people. So how do you so what when that's in somebody's background, when a seemingly little thing wiped out their entire social circle?
Well, it's important to identify the fact that it is a little thing rather than this catastrophic, overwhelming event or circumstance that they can do nothing about. Um, it's also important for people to appreciate the fact that they're not the only ones to whom this happens. That this is, you know, life is complicated, life is difficult. There are setbacks and disappointments and frustrations and rejections.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody faces it. So one of the basic issues in good psychotherapy is to really help people develop a stronger coping repertoire so they have a way of handling these things when they happen. Um, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people try to avoid difficulties rather than learn how to handle difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and handling is really one of the important components of psychotherapy. How to handle everything that comes your way so
Mm-hmm.
that you don't have to avoid it, you don't have to try to um, uh, you know act as though it's not really happening when these things do. Coping repertoire is extremely important, and a lot of people who come to therapy do not have a really well developed coping repertoire. So that's one of the main things I think in any psychotherapy that's important. Helping people know how to handle adversity, difficulty, frustration, setbacks, upset, rather than making like it maybe they can avoid it altogether.
Now, coping repertoire is an interesting terminology. That's great because I mean, one of the things I had to learn is that you can't sometimes just charge back in. You can't withdraw from the world forever, but sometimes taking an evening and going, you know what, I'm going to put everything away and I'm just going to sit for a bit because I am overloaded. I'm overwhelmed. I'm not thinking, I'm just reacting constantly. But those are my copes. Richard, I want to take a break and then come back and get more from you on suggestions for coping repertoire. Love that term. Richard B. Joelson, clinical social work psychotherapist and author of Help Me, a Psychotherapist's Tried and True Techniques for a Happier Relationship with Yourself and the People You Love. If you forget that because you're in your car or something like that, shoot me an email, Liana at Not Therapy Show, or Twitter, X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, Threads. Shoot me a message on there. What was Richard's book? And we'll come back with coping repertoire on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. We're still talking anxiety with clinical social work psychotherapist Richard B. Joelson. And before the break, Richard was talking about coping repertoires. That's the toolkit, your skills to handle adversity instead of just trying to avoid it completely, because you can't. Now, Richard, where do you start with a coping repertoire? Because you're right, the skills are not there in a lot of people.
Well, as I said before, one of the things is to help people appreciate the fact that their fears are not foretold, they're not factual, they're not going to automatically happen just because they're afraid it will. What I think people worry about all kinds of things, and a lot of their worrying is irrational. Wealthy people worry about becoming homeless.
Yeah.
People who are extremely healthy worry about getting sick. A headache all of a sudden is a brain tumor. And people get really frightened and really begin to invest in their fears. And then they are overwhelmed and don't know what to do except get anxious and become symptomatic and worry all the time. Some people really just see life through a dark lens, and it's very, very hard to get them to appreciate the fact that there may be something the matter with their perception rather than their perception must be accurate. And one of the things I think that needs to get accomplished in therapy is to help people think better so that they can change better. That means dismantling their tendency to catastrophize. It means dismantling their tendency to personalize. So people suffer from all or nothing thinking. If you're not perfect, you're a loser. Or people overgeneralize. If they got outbid on a house, then they never have any luck at anything. They're always unsuccessful and in getting what they want. And so they convince themselves that they are life victims rather than people who are having normal, healthy experiences like everyone else.
Now that I have found, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of times is false control, right? If they assume the worst and it happens, well, then they weren't wrong. They were right that it was hopeless, right? But that actually takes away their control, their ability to see the control that they do have. Because if they're so focused on what's going to go wrong, they don't have a plan to get it right. Is that consistent with what you've seen?
That's absolutely correct. People become victimized by their fears and doubts and worries, and that's not. They get busy with coping or trying to manage these adversities, and they don't necessarily think constructively or imaginatively about what they can do about it. I think it's important for people to appreciate that they have a great deal of control. And a lot of people will say, I don't have control. It's
Mm-hmm.
happening to me. There's nothing I can do about it. I just have to endure. No, no. And if that's been the standard belief, then that has to be dismantled and replaced by a much healthier attitude.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that making endurance into a virtue can be part of it, right? The long suffering example, like you said, it goes back to parents. So that obviously none of us has control over the economy, right? Or job losses or the whole COVID lockdown or those things we can't control. We can control our immediate environment. And this was something a social worker taught me, which is why I'm a big fan of social workers. The fact that if you're spending all your time focusing on what you can't control, you're not focusing on what you can control. And that pivot as it makes you feel weak at first. It makes you feel small, and you have to get through that to realize, no, it's better to focus on what you can do than all the things that you can't. Yeah.
Absolutely.
How do you help people through that? Well, it's a humbling process.
Well, I try to help people appreciate the fact that they have a great deal of authority and they have a great deal of influence and control over the things that occur. Um, that they can do the work of preventing consequences rather than just simply allowing consequences. That
Hmm.
they can influence what's going to happen next by the strength of their resolve, their determination, their ability to persevere, the fact that they have resources that they may not be utilizing because they're so busy worrying about what negative thing is going to happen to them. So it's really about empowering people to appreciate the fact that they are quite capable and that they have much more influence over what's going to occur uh, realistically than to just simply wait and hope for the best. There's something in the literature called locus of control,
Mm-hmm.
internal locus of control versus external locus of control. People with an internal locus of control believe that they have the wherewithal to influence what happens, that they can handle things, that they can influence what takes place. People with an external locus of control uh, tend to be the people who are fatalistic. There's nothing I can do. Life is difficult. Um, I can't really manage. I have to hope that I'm lucky rather than unlucky.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't utilize their good resources that they may not even be aware they have in order to influence what takes place. They just
Mm-hmm.
keep their fingers crossed and hope for the best. That's not good enough.
Yeah, yeah. Well, because and that gets into another thing I wanted to ask you about is separating the control you do have, which is granting people access to you, who you choose to spend time with,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to controlling other people's reactions. I have found a big source of anxiety for a lot of people that I work with is they are trying to guarantee an outcome involving another person, and you can't.
Right.
And that, how do you explain that pivot? Because you're very good at putting things in simple words.
Um, it's difficult because when people have a belief system that may be self-defeating, and they've been sort of operating that way for a good part of their lives, possibly prior to coming to therapy.
Yeah.
It's an important thing to introduce new concepts. Therapy is an educational process as well as a healing process.
Mm-hmm.
And people need to be informed and they need to be enlightened as to how things can occur that they may not have appreciated until they partner with a good therapist who can enlighten them and help them appreciate what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
This is why some people come and they feel sort of hopeless and they feel bereft. It's good that they've gotten to therapy. Maybe they've been encouraged by a referring physician or a friend. or a relative to seek help because they are suffering so much and nothing seems to be changing.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really important for people to appreciate the fact that things can be different, things can be better. A lot of people come to therapy and they're very skeptical, they're very doubtful, they're giving it a try. Sometimes they don't stay long enough to help it
Mm-hmm.
occur, to help the benefits take place because they're looking for a quick fix. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people come to therapy like they go to the dentist.
Yeah.
They just sit back and let the dentist do all the work. That's not the way therapy works.
Mm-hmm.
And some people need to be socialized to the experience of psychotherapy so they can know how to make the best possible use of it.
And
And that's sometimes a very challenging endeavor because some people are really not able to sustain the length of time it usually takes for meaningful change to take place.
because you're talking 6 months to a year before anything really gets going.
Well, hopefully some people can appreciate the potential for therapy in the earliest phase.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I wrote an article called Relief or Change. I had a patient who was referred by his doctor because he was so anxious, he was having panic attacks, and he was really suffering terribly. So we had a couple of sessions, and his symptoms disappeared. And I said to myself, "Oh my goodness, this is what's called a flight to health. This guy
Yeah.
is not going to. This guy's not going to come back for session two because he got so much benefit out of session one." Well, he came back for session two and session three, but by then he said, "I feel so much better. I'm not having any more panic attacks, and I don't know if I really need to continue in therapy because I feel so much better." Well, that to me was like, oh my gosh, this guy just got relief. He didn't get change.
Right.
Well, then I appreciated the fact that sometimes relief is change. All
Mm-hmm.
this guy needed was to not be symptomatic. And
Right.
I spoke to his doctor 6 months after he left after the third session. The doctor said this guy has not had a panic attack since those three sessions. He's doing extremely well. And whatever you did was terrific, and he's very happy. And he talks about his three-session, wonderful therapy. So sometimes it just takes a couple of visits for people to feel better, and then they can utilize their already existing resources to continue to sustain the gains. Other people need a much, much longer and more detailed therapeutic experience for there to be sustainable change. Sometimes people do very well early on, and then those gains dissipate pretty
Mm-hmm.
quickly
Mm-hmm.
because they have no place to put them.
Mm-hmm.
So therapy really is longer than most people would like it to be, but there are people who have been in therapy for years because that's what it takes for them to be as good as they can be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you need tune-ups along the way too. Things can be going
That's
real well
exact.
until they're not. Yep.
That's exactly what I call it. It's
Yep.
always gratifying when somebody comes back for a tune-up after 3, 5, 10, 12 years because they realize that something has developed in their lives and they would benefit from coming back to the person who helped them initially and to sort of have a opportunity to solidify the gains that they made or to have a refresher so that they can be additionally helped.
Richard B. Joelson, Doctor of Social Welfare. If you want to check out more of Richard's work, check out his book, Help Me, a Psychotherapist, Tried and True Techniques for a Happier Relationship with Yourself and the People You Love. His website is richardbjolsonsw.com. We'll put that in all the social media stuff because I messed that up. Richard, thank you so much for coming on and breaking it down really well for us.
Good. I appreciate it. It was nice to be with you. Thanks very much.
All right, we'll be back after this final break with some final thoughts. didn't run long, this show. Go me. Finally, I get him every so once in a while. If you have questions, comments, concerns, anything at all, Liana at nottherapyshow.com. Liana at nottherapyshow.com is my email, or nottherapyshow.com. Join the mailing list, fill out the comment form, or Not Therapy Show on X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram, and Threads. Back in a bit on It's Not Therapy. The following program is a peer-to-peer advice show and does not diagnose mental health conditions. If you're seeking social services, please call or text 211 or go to 211.ca. We're back on It's Not Therapy. I'm still Liana Kersner. I'm still not a therapist. In the last minutes of the show, I want to loop back around to what Richard talked about regarding being insight-rich and change poor. Insight-rich and change poor. I love that phrase because it's so true. I spent so many years stuck knowing what I wasn't happy with, but I had no idea how to make the necessary changes to be happier. And then when I did know how, I was flat out terrified of doing it. As a peer counselor, I work with a lot of very smart people who have had a lot of therapy, and they've developed great insights and also a ton of logic loops, which are driving them away from change and right back into the same old, same old. I recognize the signs because I used to do the same thing. The minute I thought about making changes, the old programming would kick in, telling me how I was stupid, I wasn't worth it, I was just ungrateful, annoying, and the real problem was that I was so innately bad that everyone around me merely tolerated me until they couldn't stand me anymore. Now, eventually, I just leaned into those thoughts and did what Richard talked about. So what? I'm ungrateful. So what if I'm unbearably annoying? So what if, despite all my efforts, my immortal soul is doomed somehow because I'm just secretly terrible at my core? Well, okay, if metaphysics actually worked that way, that last one is more than kind of bad. But the other two, well, it really hurts to be called those things. For me, a lot. But being annoying isn't a moral failing. People are weird this way. They'll tolerate one person's terrible behavior while they'll stomp on another person just for being irritating. The hard part is that none of it ever makes any sense. It's this weird game of follow the leader. The lack of stability a lot of people are facing right now is no joke hard. The threat of being ostracized, especially when your living situation depends on a group, your job situation, something critical, that's terrifying. But being terrified that I was annoying wasn't making me less annoying. Sadly, and I mean, this was a hard lesson, but it actually helps in the long run, I've gotten used to people turning on me, stabbing me in the back. I'm used now to being ostracized and kicked out of things. But I'm still here scraping by. And in a lot of ways, that's enough. I'm still kicking. Times are legitimately tough right now. They are. They are historically tough. But worrying about history repeating itself in your own life doesn't stop it from happening. Making different choices results in different outcomes. It isn't until you start making different choices that you see that your patterns aren't inevitable. And some people won't like the changes. So what? All right, if anything inspires a question, comment, or suggestion, I can hear some people grumbling at me at that one, but trust me, just try it, right? Just try it. Try it. So what? So what? Somebody's mad at you. You're not responsible for their feelings. They're mad. They'll get over it or they won't, right? You'll make it right or you won't. They have a legitimate beef or they don't. These things are not easy, but they're not terribly complicated. So, what could some of these changes possibly look like? Little changes, right? Okay, maybe not so little. You know where I'm going to start. I'm a broken record on boundaries. Setting better boundaries. Better boundaries are good. Remember, top 10 phrase, people don't have to like your boundaries, they do have to respect them. And that's tied into what I touched on a bit with Richard about not taking responsibility for other people's feelings. This is a concept that a lot of people struggle with, but once you get it, it's really liberating. You can care that someone is upset without having to fix that they are upset, because you can't. They're their feelings, not yours. Scrambling around trying to read their minds is probably only going to make things worse. Connected to that is the idea, I mentioned it earlier. Stop trying to control other people's reactions. A lot of people don't realize how much they're trying to control other people's reactions, either by avoiding giving them information they may not like hearing or that may cause them to make a choice you don't like. Using subtle, people don't like it, but emotional blackmail, manipulations, really dig deep. And with those exchanges that might have blown up or were really uncomfortable, you felt anxious, were you trying to control other people's reactions instead of just, communicating fairly and openly and not taking responsibility for other people's feelings, right? If you don't feel like I can do this with the people around you, you feel your social circle's a little too precarious, go out, meet some new people. Just pick a thing. Doesn't have to matter what the thing is. Just pick a thing. Meet some new people. If you hate your job, you don't have to quit, at least not right away. Start polishing up your resume, focusing on your accomplishments. Get your friends to help you. It can be a huge boost to see what you've actually accomplished, what improvements and changes you made in your current job. And if you can't figure anything out, start doing some stuff, because that's what employers are looking for right now. Make some changes, make some suggestions, get some solutions implemented at work. It feels good. Something you can control a lot more than that, because we know what I say, top 10 phrase, healthy goals are based on things you can control. Take a small risk with the mindset that the whole point is to possibly fail or probably fail. A lot of people don't start things that are fun because they're afraid they're going to look silly. They're afraid they're going to make a fool out of themselves. But the whole point of a course is for you to learn. No one starts instantly good at complicated things like music or drawing or even sports. Try things, little things. And the whole idea is to do it. The reactions of other people don't matter. The fact that you took that first step does. So, so, so important. Top 10 phrase. Be the hero of your own story and not anyone else's. And if you have anxiety, another change you can make is embodied by another of my top 10 phrases. Listen twice before you talk once. Listen twice before you talk once. I always repeat it because we may think we're hearing the other person, but a lot of the times what we're really hearing is what we're anticipating or what we're afraid of. If you find that there's a pattern in your life that conversations get very big and spiral out of control and you're not sure why, it may be because of this. Because you are anticipating responses instead of really listening to what you're being told. And you're not checking out the meaning before you switch into problem-solving mode. So listen twice. Summarize what you understand the person said before responding. It feels awkward at first, but the more you do it, the more natural and conversational it becomes. This has a two-pronged benefit. One, it gives you some time to slow the conversation down and think a bit before you respond without there being dead silence. A lot of anxiety, especially social anxiety, comes from not knowing what to do in interactions. Well, you don't have to know what to do. Nobody knows what to do all the time. Other people know what to do about not knowing what to do, and listening's a big part of that. So listen. And if you're like, I don't understand that at all, try to put it in your own words. Say to the person, what I understand you're telling me is, and say to them what you understand slowly. And then stop and say, did I get that right? People love to correct you if it's not right. And it actually slows down, gives you a chance to truly understand. And don't proceed until the other person says, yes, that's right. Keep repeating it back to them. Have I got that right? It slows down the conversation. It gives you time. And it lets both people in the exchange feel more in control. And feeling more in control is essential. Another thing that can reduce anxiety, make decisions based on your core values. Remember, top 10 phrase. Core values are more important to relationships than common interests. Instead of making decisions based on the outcome you want, make decisions based on what's right, what's fair, and what's kind. That way, even if the other person doesn't respond well or the group doesn't respond well, you know at least you stayed true to your principles and your sense of right and wrong. But if you do actually think that you are responsible for some of the communication issues, hey, work on those. That's great. That is something you can change. You can control. Ask your friends for feedback and ask them how you could make your intents better match what comes out of your mouth. So that's the show for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. And keep in mind, not what if, so what? NotTherapyShow.com if you want to join our mailing list or fill out our contact form. Liana at Not Therapy Show if you want to email me any suggestions, comments, concerns directly, or at Not Therapy Show on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and Threads at Not Therapy Show on social media. I look forward to hearing from you. And until next time, your crazy is only a problem if it's hurting you. Have a great week.